Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. World of Warcraft is an almost 13-year-old game that still somehow manages to look and feel right at home in today's industry. Over the years, its competitors have often went for a more realistic or even hyper-realistic look, technically pushing higher resolution counts and higher polygon counts than World of Warcraft, yet when we compare most of these games to World of Warcraft today, it's often clear that WoW has just aged better. Why is this? Style. Over the years, Blizzard have created a pretty timeless art style that isn't overly hardware dependent. While the technical solution to a problem might be initially impressive, often the creative solution is the timeless one. It's the one that really lasts. So today we are going to take a look at the evolution of the World of Warcraft art style right from the franchise's beginning as perhaps a licensed Game Workshop title right up to the modern day. Let's begin with Warcraft 1. So Warcraft Orcs and Humans was a small enough game that it was originally made with basically no story, and actually most of the dialogue was improv by one of the game's producers. It didn't even have Blizzard cutscenes, something which we kind of love today, and when you look at its tech, well, you wouldn't really think we could actually learn much about its art style. Well, there is actually something else here. Warcraft was originally supposed to be a licensed Warhammer game, which I think does explain a lot when you think about Blizzard. As an example, say the similarities between StarCraft and Warhammer 40k, they're pretty apparent too. Now what's interesting here is seeing Blizzard move away from those early roots as perhaps a Warhammer tie-in and really create their own identity as the years roll on. So, it's time for Warcraft 2. Unlike its predecessor, Warcraft 2 has full Blizzard cinematics. These give us a great look at what the team were thinking of style-wise. Now, they likely had great technical limitations, so while the texture work and the lighting can't really tell us too much about their art style, their proportions can. Looking at the Warcraft 2 orcs, you see they are very different from the orcs that we currently know. They're a little bit thinner, like some of the lesser Warhammer orcs, actually. While the Zeppelins are quite similar, their boats don't look particularly orcish. Also, the humans of Warcraft 2 are realistically proportioned in comparison to the hulking beasts with overly long arms and massive hands that we have today in-game. There's also less of a defined style to the human kingdom as well. Much of it feels pretty much like just generic middle-age style fantasy. Perhaps closer to Warhammer's Empire than modern Warcraft's humans. Now, by the time Warcraft 3 released, we saw a large change in the style of the game. It immediately feels more defined and more unique than its predecessors, with a more interesting color palette, more chunky models, and big, well-defined textures to go on them. Model design in RTS games, of course, is pretty interesting because they've got to be quite exaggerated for readability, and one thing you see in Warcraft 3 is that the buildings and the units are all very well defined and stylized. This is where we see the humans and orcs begin to take their World of Warcraft forms. Both are more chunky here than in the previous games, with the humans really looking sort of more like big high fantasy knights than what we saw with some of the Warcraft 2 stuff. This is also where they define much of what we would see in World of Warcraft itself, with the elves, the Naga, many other locations and things like that would all come together to make up the World of Warcraft. It is amazing to see just how much progress the team made in the 6 years and 6 months between this game's release and Warcraft 2's. Of course, Diablo 1 and 2, as well as StarCraft and Brood War came out between these games. StarCraft did a great job of pushing the Blizzard style, even though all they really did was they just put a twist on Space Marines, Tyranids, and Eldar, but perhaps it's that process of putting a twist on those things that gave them a lot of the experience that they would need to define World of Warcraft better. So let's talk about the sort of early pre-alpha-ish period of Warcraft. Things really began to heat up during the development of World of Warcraft. The game started off essentially as Warcraft 3, but with a behind the character camera. You can see this quite clearly in the game's earlier models, which are technically still in the client today. They're closer to some of the War 3 stuff. One thing that is quite interesting is how there was a slightly more realistic style to some of the earlier World of Warcraft art assets. This is mostly apparent, I think, with human models. We've got a range of models, including some slightly chunky ones, and then some also more realistically proportioned ones. There's a bit of a mix there. We even have an armored knight who basically is the guy from the beginning of the Warcraft 3 opening cinematic. The other races do seem to be a bit more locked down style-wise, and I think that's because it's really hard to get humans right. Of course, we are humans, so, we're humans, we look at humans every day, so if a human looks slightly wrong, it really will stand out to us. Now, a few of these models were still used in the game, but definitely quite sparingly. Now, when you look at the older trailers of World of Warcraft, you do see that it feels quite different to the vanilla that we know. And really, when you trace things back far enough and you keep on going down the rabbit hole, the game did start off as a mix of the developers playing EverQuest and then also experimenting with a behind-the-character camera mixed in with a few of Warcraft 3's RPG elements. That would be way back, sort of during the, the earlier prototyping phase. But let's move on to actual vanilla World of Warcraft. In vanilla, we see really the core of what makes World of Warcraft look the way that it does today. Many of the design principles, such as the chunky dimensions and the somewhat larger-than-life texturing, they're all seen here. It's a great example of low-fidelity art assets that are designed to be viewed from a distance, and sure, that means that things do look quite rough on their own, but it all comes together to make a really nice, cohesive presentation. That said, the game, well, I think it is slightly more stylized today, as we've sort of progressively seen Blizzard double down on what has worked well with the art style, which has resulted in the game, I think, nowadays, having a more unique look than it did at the very beginning. All of that said, the chunky, crisp look of today's art probably would not have been possible with the tech that they had back then, and they did a brilliant job for the time. It still does stand as an example that all the fancy technology in the world will not save you if the actual art style is weak. Now, we're going to skip on ahead to Wrath. Both Wrath and TBC are, of course, they're great examples of brilliant art styles. They're very much an evolution of what vanilla established. There were progressive bumps in quality with these expansions, but really nothing massive. Wrath did add something quite new though. It added dynamic shadows to the game, so that's really one of its main contributions to the overall graphics of WoW. When you move on to Cataclysm, once again we see the usual expansion to expansion bump in asset quality, but definitely still something that I would say is evolutionary. Cataclysm did add one very major thing though, new water effects, as well as some new spell effects and some other minor things. Generally just a really good bump in the overall quality. Now we move on to Mists of Pandaria, and I think Mists is really where we begin to see a large change in the art direction and the graphical fidelity of World of Warcraft. It had a minimum spec bump, improved effects, but more importantly, it laid the foundations of many large improvements to the game's presentation. So, the Pandaren had the most advanced character models that had been seen in World of Warcraft, with more detailed skeletons and then better rigs to control them, so that the animators would have way more control over the characters. We even saw Garrosh's model evolve over time and essentially be a proof of concept for the new character models of Warlords of Draenor. We also saw a noticeable increase in the crispness of the game's assets. Why? Well, I think it's a mixture of higher resolution textures, but also textures that seem to have more baked-in lighting and effects, and then stronger line work. We also have some more complex scenes, especially we've got things like higher ground clutter densities, which overall give you a more lush environment. Now, Warlords of Draenor had quite a few contributions to the game. First of all, the updated renderer that was added in patch 6.1 allowed for a whole host of new fantastic graphical effects, including lighting and things like that, which really enhanced the depth and richness of game scenes. The new models were another overall brilliant move, but I think they did end up maybe being a bit too much on the goofy and comedic side of things in comparison to what they were previously. Overall, though, the general refinements to the art style that we saw be pushed in Mists of Pandaria did continue through Warlords, resulting really in some of the most impressive overall scenes that we've seen in-game. And finally, we hit Legion. It's the culmination of all of these things. It significantly increased the game's view distance, added some new effects, new character animations, and it brought loads of new spell effects and things to the game. You really can see the result of Blizzard's continued refinement of the art style in things as simple as, say, a tree or a wolf. While I think they always looked goofy, Blizzard have managed to find a really timeless style as the years have went on, which means they don't really need to care about what the rest of the industry looks like. It's a bit like with Team Fortress 2. So, as an example, Battlefield 1 looks really impressive, but TF2 was able to have, I think, an equally satisfying presentation all the way back in 2007, just by being stylized. Looking at the competition, even games that released quite recently, like Guild Wars 2, Star Wars The Old Republic, or even, dare I say, Final Fantasy XIV, I think they look a lot worse than modern World of Warcraft on account of how their art styles were quite tied to the technology of the day. WildStar is actually another example of a game that I think looks great today because of its style, and I think Black Desert Online deserves a shout out. It looks stunning, and it's perhaps an example of an MMO with a vaguely realistic style that finally looks good enough to perhaps actually stand the test of time. So there you go, that is a look at the evolution of the Warcraft franchise's art style from the very beginning up to what we see today. I think it's a fascinating look at how a company can refine their style and find something that really, really works. And something that actually works company-wide, because you can see a lot of what was kind of pioneered with World of Warcraft just be reflected across Blizzard, like Heroes of the Storm, which has that similar, chunky, really well-defined style. It's the same rough art style with World of Warcraft that has been evolved and has managed to stand the test of time and pretty much look great for years. But anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.